Hello, as promised, answering all the old questions that I've been ignoring for years. So here we go. I found two questions, both of them like super old from like 3 years ago. So first come, first serve. And even though there's two questions, one kind of leads into the other. So I thought it would be really cool to address both of these in a single video because they are related. So here we go. Was wondering if you could make a video talking about clawing feet. I've seen it mentioned a couple of times around the internet, but it confuses me. Like when you're pointing your toes really hard, aren't you supposed to claw a little bit? I've read something about intrinsic versus extrinsic foot muscles making the difference, but I still don't get exactly what to do or what not to do. Thanks. And then similarly, an in-depth video on what knuckling is and how to avoid it would be super helpful. It's a problem for me sometimes, or none of the explanations I get or the assistance I seek getting fitted better have been very useful, thank you. So it's been 3 years. I'm sure these folks have probably already gotten their answers from somewhere else by now, but if you didn't, or if you are a new person that is wondering the same thing, well, here we go. A quick verbal explanation. Clawing is when your toes are doing the pointing and sometimes doing the scrunching, but the whole foot is not pointing. And I'll obviously demonstrate very soon. I do talk about this a little bit in my how to improve your instep video, because a lot of the muscles that you need to engage to prevent clawing are the same muscles that kind of enhance your instep. But I do not explicitly talk about extrinsic and intrinsic muscles. Extrinsic muscles are the big muscles outside of the foot. They're like your calf muscle, your shin muscle. That's like the big basic muscle that helps you do a releve, that helps you, bend your joint. The big muscles, you can do a million releves and it won't necessarily strengthen your intrinsic muscles. So intrinsic, inside, interior are what people will refer to as the tiny baby muscles in your feet. You have a lot of little tiny baby muscles in your feet that don't connect to any other joint. And they all kind of like crisscross and they make a little network. Dance medicine and physical therapy have finally been making like more and more of a breakthrough. So now, luckily, fortunately, younger dancers are learning about these muscles earlier and strengthening them earlier and preventing injuries and having a much longer career for it. But this is not something that the average dance studio will teach. Therefore, when you have weak intrinsic muscles and when you are clawing your feet, this can lead to knuckling in a pointe shoe. You see how these are kind of connecting, why I wanted to do both of them in one video? So knuckling, same thing. It's when your toes are pointing, just kind of like the metatarsals where your toe joints are. Like that part is pointing, but the whole ankle is not pointing. And this usually gives the appearance of like falling back or being held back in your pointe shoe. You see a lot of this in the hip lay girls because, they're not doing real classical pointe work. They're doing something else, and therefore they are back in their shoes a lot. Sometimes this is a result of having an ill-fitting shoe, but more often than not, it is a result of poor training. So I'm going to demonstrate. I'm going to give you a couple of exercises. I also attached a pretty cool link that explains this probably way better than I can, but now is time for the visual examples. So this is clawing. See, the foot actually looks like a claw. It's when the toes are trying to point, usually they're scrunching, it's just from the knuckles down that are contracting, but you're not involving the rest of the foot. None of these in-between muscles are really being engaged properly. So you get this like crunchy toe thing, but nothing else is really working. And usually the most common reason this happens is just poor training. Nobody taught the student how to really use and engage the whole foot. Alternatively, a beginner dancer might just have very stiff feet, very stiff ankles, and like it hurts them to kind of stretch the top of the foot and achieve all that mobility. Pain or an injury, especially ankle impingement, which, I struggle with a lot, even though I already had a surgery for it. It hurts to, almost like tuck the heel bone. So we prevent clawing and scrunching by training all the intrinsic muscles, which are hard to target. It usually involves a lot of very small, intricate movements. It's stuff like wiggling the toes. It's stuff like doming, which is really hard to explain and really tedious and really boring to do, so nobody wants to do it. It's basically training to point your toes without using your toes. It's like everything from here to here and training them to contract. And it has nothing to do with the toes. You leave the toes out of it. These are the intrinsic muscles in here. And when you start strengthening these muscles, you'll see how it starts to activate up here. So now's the time to use my slipper foot because this will get stuck on the marley. So when the time comes to do a tendu, you can't just do that. That's just clawing the foot. And there are so many ways to think about this, but the most common one is to imagine you're massaging the floor, and that means going through all those intrinsic muscles. It's not just pop it out, it's massage and go through all those muscles. And then you're kind of like engaging the whole foot properly. And to address the question, don't you claw a little bit? Like, don't you need to claw to point the foot all the way? Well, yes and no. When you're doing footwork, when your foot has to disengage from the floor and when it has to accept the floor, you should not be crunching like this, because then you can land on your foot the wrong way and you can potentially hurt yourself. If your foot is safely in the air and not, going to be landing anytime soon, you can give it like a little extra tiny bit of a squeeze in the toes, but do not do it at the cost of ruining the line of your foot. They're still somewhat straight, because imagine you're in a pointe shoe. How can you crunch your toes inside a pointe shoe? Your toes are kind of locked in place. Pointe shoes are not as flexible as slippers, so while you can scrunchy, crunchy, and claw your way in a slipper, you can't really do that in a pointe shoe, or if you do, you might start knuckling, which we're going to talk about soon. It's really this. Your toes do kind of stay straight and lengthened. When you're doing footwork especially, it's not a crunchy short feeling, it's a strengthen and lengthen feeling. I'll just slap on one shoe because I'm not doing any real dancing, I'm just demonstrating some knuckling. So this is knuckling, when the toes are kind of pointed, but the whole rest of the foot is not pointing. You're not engaging the whole foot. You're breaking the line of the ankle, but the toes are still just barely hanging on for dear life. I talk about this in proper releve for beginners. basically the second half of the video when I talk about point shoes. Ugh, and I can actually feel my toes scrunching under, like in the point shoe when I do this, and that's so not okay. Don't do this. This is, yikes, a result of bad training, a result of a weak releve, a weak ankle, a weak foot, weak muscles in the knee, because you should be able to straighten your knee all the way in a point shoe. Most of the time when you see people knuckling, the knee is also bent, or they just do not have this strength or this mobility in the whole foot to get all of the weight like properly where it belongs. And as I said, sometimes it is a result of an injury, like very painful impingement. Maybe the dancer is afraid to point the foot because that stresses the heel. Or sometimes the dancer just has very, very stiff feet and doesn't have the mobility to do this, in which case they should not be on point shoes. So extrinsic muscles are the big muscles that manage the big movements. So this motion is extrinsic. These are muscles that attach to your shin. This is technically extrinsic. These muscles attach up here. And of course, this is extrinsic. This is just the big calf muscle. But you can do all these extrinsic exercises all you want, and it's not going to target the intrinsic muscles in here, which is really where a nice pointed foot and lengthened toes comes from. It's a long reach, it's a long lengthen. It's not a shorten and scrunch. I hope this gave you something to think about. I hope you get curious and explore more intrinsic muscle exercises so that you can have very strong feet and prevent injury and have a very long, healthy dance career. Thank you so much for watching, and stay salty.